Hi, I'm Mark Madison, and I'd like to welcome you to another in our monthly series of Conservationists in Action. Today, we have a very exciting speaker. We're very lucky to lure here to Shepherdstown. We have children's author Lynn Cherry with us. And for those of you who haven't heard of Lynn, the very few of you who haven't, Lynn has written over 30 children's books, a number of which have won awards. She also illustrates them. A few of my favorites are The Great Kapok Tree, A River Ran Wild, The Armadillo from Amarillo, and my kids' favorite, How Groundhog's Garden Grew. They love your books. She's also been very active in trying to empower children and get them into nature. And she's been out here this week at NCTC talking with some of our students, talking with some of our staff out here, and just really adding a lot of value to our educational work out here. So Lynn, welcome to the studio, and it's so good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Lynn's going to talk a little about empowering children through books and nature, and I'm going to turn over to Lynn at this point. I would just like to remind those of you in the audience, this is actually a live broadcast, so if you have any questions for Lynn about her children's books, about children and nature, about empowering children and things you can do for the environment, please feel free to call in, email in, fax in, any means you can communicate with us. We'd love to hear your questions. All right, Lynn, let me turn over to you.
Well, I just thought I'd begin before I show the PowerPoint
Okay.
to show the audience this Japanese stiltgrass, which I picked on the way here. And this became, it's an invasive species, and I noticed it at my place. I have a farm about 3 years ago, and I didn't realize it was such an invasive, and now it's completely carpeting my whole forest floor and has pushed out all the native wildflowers. So this is just along the edges here at NCTC, and you have time to actually do something.
We'll learn from your experience.
Learn from my travails, and just if it comes in a lot on mowers, like if you have someone mowing your lawn, the lawn companies, and it's
Have you been able to control yours at all, or is it too late now?
It is too late, so that's why I thought I'd share this with you before it's not too late, and people out there, Japanese stiltgrass.
Okay. Well, thanks for empowering NCTC. And now, do you want to go into some of the slides?
Sure. Yeah. Let's just go into the slides. This is a presentation that I give all around the country, actually all around the continent, and I start by talking about how it is that I started writing and drawing. And my mom was an illustrator. She was an illustrator of children's magazines when I was a little kid. And I have a book called Making a Difference in the World that shows me and my little card table doing the illustrations while my mom was doing illustrations. And then I grew up and became an illustrator. And then she followed in my footsteps, and she became a children's book illustrator. And this is one of her books, The Floating House. It's a history by Scott Russell Sanders. And she's really done some beautiful books, The Real Tooth Fairy. Whoops. And this is probably her most popular. So anyway, when I was a kid, I had inspiration, and I would do these little books like this, Kitty's Adventures. And this was a book about my cat, and I learned a lot from my cat. I learned that if you sit absolutely still in the woods, that the animals come up to you. And so I would go and do this. That book I brought to my publisher when I was in my 20s, and she said, "This is a really good story you wrote when you were 8, but you've improved a little bit as an illustrator. So can you redo the illustrations?" And I did, and so they published it as this book here, Archie, Follow Me. And then, whoops, I'm going to get the hang of this. So this is part of the book, Kitty's Adventures. I didn't include this in Archie, Follow Me, but when I was about 8, my cat disappeared, and she was like a dog. She'd follow me everywhere. And when I finally found her, she was in a steel leg hold trap. And you can see her paw was stuck in the trap, and she'd been in this trap for 4 days. She'd lost a lot of blood, and she was very weak. We had to find someone who could get this trap open. And the vet wanted to put her to sleep, but I said, no, I wanted to nurse her back to health, and I did, and she lived to be a ripe old age.
No, that's a great story.
Yeah.
Except for the leg trap.
Yes.
Sorry for the kitty.
But that's how I learned about steel leg hold traps, and I knew that as an adult I would never wear a fur coat after seeing the torture that my cat went through, realizing that foxes and all kinds of animals captured for fur coats go through the same. So the place that I spent my childhood, it was in a suburb, but it was on the edge of farms and fields and creeks, and so I used to play in a place very much like this. And I think that most people who go into environmental education, who work at nature centers, that they'll tell you the same story, that they bonded with nature at an early age.
Yeah.
And so this is so important that kids get out in nature, and this is really what I'm committed to, is connecting kids to the natural world. So I was, well, I'll go back to this Archie Follow Me book for a minute. So I would sit still as a statue, and all these animals would come out of hiding, and they'd come right up to me. Like in this case, a pheasant came right up to she came right up to my foot and then sniffed it, and I realized that, and then she realized that I was human, and she went squawking off into the underbrush with her chicks. And, oops. So as I sat there, like a statue, I'd notice all these birds, and this place that I would go, I noticed that every year the same birds came back to the same nests and to the same nest holes, and this was their habitat.
Yeah.
So I illustrated this book called When I'm Sleepy. It was by Valerie Show Carey, I believe. And this is, you can see the little girl imagining she's sleeping with these various creatures in their habitats.
It's so nice to see kids not afraid of raccoons or rabies. I mean, you know.
Yeah, there's a lot of fear-mongering.
Not to digress, but I mean, we've made kids so afraid of so much in nature. It's really problematic.
I do believe it's the media that has done that, and we're just, when you think of the danger of getting into a car, I mean, the risk is just, it's just so far more of a risk than going outside.
Yeah. Beautifully illustrated.
Yeah. Oh, that says Alsik Moben. This is When I'm Sleepy. It's by Jane Howard. I'm sorry, it was another book by that other author.
Okay.
So this is by Jane Howard. Habitat. Gotta have a habitat. It's a book by, a song by Bill Oliver. Mm-hmm. And there are 7 frogs in this picture, and they're camouflaged. And I explained to kids how a lot of reasons that the animals live in their habitat, is a specific habitat, is because they can be really cryptic. They can almost disappear. And this is in my backyard.
Oh, wow.
And leaf litter. Wet leaves are really important, as I'm sure a lot of the viewers realize, that there's a real problem with frogs and amphibians die-off. And a lot of it is because people break up the leaves. They don't allow wet leaves to stay on the lawn, and it's destroying habitat. And I think we can all be very grateful to Richard Louv, who I know spoke here at NCTC, for his book, Last Child in the Woods, which put together a lot of the scholarly work on what he calls nature deficit disorder, about how kids are growing up without the advantage of connecting to nature and to the natural world.
He did one of these broadcasts, and this is a nice follow-up, because
Oh,
one of the things
great.
Richard said is we need new ways to entice children to nature, and I think your books do a wonderful job of that.
I think they do. I'm really happy that it seems to be working, because whenever kids go outside, it's an adventure.
Yeah.
Just stepping outside the door, something happens. You know, whether it's finding a turtle or just watching the birds or listening to the bird song. So one of the things that I've been promoting is schoolyard gardens, backyard gardens and schoolyard gardens. And of course, National Wildlife Federation has had this program for many years. But this is a school I visited in Virginia, Tuckahoe Elementary, where the whole curriculum revolves around outdoor education and their schoolyard garden. And they teach about how habitat is really important for, to provide wildlife with food, shelter, and place to live, place to raise their young. The first thing that you can do, whether it's your backyard, your schoolyard, your nature center, really simple thing is just plant sunflowers, because goldfinches, tufted titmice, a lot of birds just love those sunflowers. And I actually prefer them to a bird feeder, because the birds are still acting like birds, and they're learning how to forage. And plus, they're beautiful. And also, they're also beneficial for pollinators, bees and butterflies. And then you can plant other kinds of flowers that will attract hummingbirds. So there's a book by Steve Kress called The Backyard Bird Garden. It's a wonderful book. And it explains how you can plant certain plants that will attract certain birds. You can actually garden for specific birds to attract them.
Steve did one of these programs, too,
Did
many
he
years
really?
ago in 1999.
Oh,
the other thing you can use sunflowers for is to cover up an ugly garage. Like I inherited in my backyard. We plant them all around. Now you can't see it.
And they're
So that's a
beautiful.
bonus.
And then once they grow really big, they're really nice little forts for kids who can crawl inside. Yeah, Sunflower House, that's a nice book. So kids at the school they lobbied to create a no-mow zone, realizing that meadowland, grassland, was disappearing. And so their principal agreed, and they created this no-mow zone. And what they did first is they did a census where they went down on the grass on their hands and knees and magnifying glasses, and scientifically they looked at what was living in a square foot. Each kid took a square foot of this grass, and they found insects and some arthropods, but really not that much compared to when they let it grow. And once they let it grow, just the biodiversity was staggering, because birds came and were eating the seeds from the grass, and rabbits and voles and all kinds of animals were then using that as habitat. And it was very exciting for the kids. One of my big bandwagons is turn off the TV and go outside, get animated. So a lot of kids have these TV-free weeks at their school, and the parents spend time with their kids in the evenings. They go to town meetings. They get involved in their community. They go talk to their neighbors. And right now we have really a breakdown of community, and I think part of it is because of television. So turn off the TV and do something with your children, and hopefully get involved in your community. Or go read an environmental book.
Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, quite a few. All right. I did this poster when I lived in Ithaca. The Family Reading Partnership gives a free book to every child that's born in Ithaca.
Oh, wow.
And reading is a value that they're trying to purvey as a community, which is wonderful. That's my dogs, Jasper and Rocky, in that. What you know and love, you will care for. And so we go out on nature hikes. We found this red eft at one point. And again, you can see leaf litter.
Yep.
Very important. Keep those leaves, those wet leaves on the ground. This was under a rotted log, yellow-spotted salamander. So I had mentioned that woods that I had when I was a kid, and I used to spend every waking hour there. And I knew every tree, what lived in every tree, what birds lived in every nest. And I came home from school one day, and they were bulldozing it. And this was one of the great traumatic experiences of my life. I thought, where did all those animals go, and did they survive? And I couldn't even go to school for a week. I was just crying and very upset. But then, as was all things, time heals all wounds. And as I grew up, I forgot about that woods. Not totally, but the pain subsided. But then when I started hearing about the rainforest, that whole feeling of loss welled up, and I thought, I have to write a book that lets kids know about the destruction of the tropical rainforest, and maybe they can do something about it. And they really have. Kids have raised thousands of dollars. They've saved thousands of acres of rainforest, especially in Monteverde, Costa Rica, in the eternal forest of the children. They raise pennies for the planet. They put on plays. They get these certificates from Nature Conservancy for saving acres. And it's really remarkable what they're doing. To research my book, I went to Brazil, and this is a real kapok tree here.
Oh, cool.
And they are the tallest tree in the rainforest. They're an emergent, so they emerge over the canopy, and they're really remarkable trees. This is one in St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So I went to Brazil. I flew from D.C. down to Florida, and then took another plane and flew to Manaus in Brazil. And I stayed there for a couple weeks, and that was the flight was 18 hours, but that was the easy part of the trip. When I got there, I found what I'd been reading about, the destruction of rainforests for cattle ranches. And this was an aha moment, because I took a look at these cattle, and I thought, these cattle might be butchered, they might be made into hamburger, and I might be eating them. They might be shipped abroad. And if I'm doing that, then I'm part of the reason for the destruction of the rainforest. So I thought, I am never eating a cow. I'm never eating a hamburger again unless I know where that came from. Where it came from. Right. This was the scariest moment of my trip, looking down, going down a really windy road. You're looking through the windshield of a Jeep. And this friend who was an ethnobotanist had told me the story of going down one of these, and his car started spinning around because the roads are like mud. They're like ice. They're wet mud. And he'd spun around. His car had flipped over. He'd been thrown out of the window. He'd broken his arm and his leg. Laid there for hours till someone finally found him. So we went down this, and the car was just spinning around out of control. But luckily, we didn't flip over, and we got to the bottom in one piece. So getting back to the book, the man goes into the forest, and he starts cutting the tree. And the heat and the hum of the forest lull him to sleep. And as he sleeps, these different creatures come down and whisper in his ear a litany of reasons why he shouldn't cut the tree. And every plant and animal in this book is a real rainforest plant or animal. Is totally scientifically accurate. This is an emerald green boa, and the boa constrictor slithers down the tree and hisses in the man's ear, "Senor, this is a tree of miracles. My ancestors have lived here for generations. You must not cut it down." This is a silky anteater. It has very soft, silky fur and a very long tongue, and it sticks his tongue into hollow logs to get the ants out, which is why it's called an anteater. And the anteater says, "Senor, the big man tells you to chop down a beautiful tree. He does not think of his own children, who tomorrow must live in a world without trees." And the jaguar says, "Senor, if you chop down this tree, where will I find my dinner?" So every day I would do what I did when I was a kid, and I'd go into the forest and sit absolutely still and paint my paintings. And as I was sitting here by this stream, I heard this sound coming from the underbrush, sort of like a... I thought, that sounds like a jaguar. What do I do if that's a jaguar? Do I sit here? Do I jump up and run? To jump up and yell boo?
Yeah.
I didn't know. So I listened, and after a while I heard it again. Finally I saw it. And what it was a 2-inch-long hummingbird.
Oh.
And I was greatly relieved, but it came right up to me.
Yeah.
And when I went back to the base camp, I asked, well, what would I have done if that was a jaguar? And they said the worst thing you could have done would have been to get up and run, because it might have thought you were prey.
Right.
If you had just sat there, it probably would have ignored you. But if you jumped up and yelled boo, it would have taken off like a shot, because we are their worst enemies.
That makes sense.
So getting back to the book, the man wakes up. He's surrounded by these rare and wondrous creatures. He stands up, draws back his arm, well, picks up the axe, draws back his arm as if to strike the tree, and then he hesitates, and he drops his axe and walks out of the rainforest, thereby saving all these animals who depend on the kapok tree. When I was in Peru, we found a little sloth. Actually, the native people eat sloth, and they had killed the mother of this little sloth, and the native people brought this little sloth that fit in my hand in their dugout canoe down the river, and we didn't think it was alive, but one of the teacher's sons said, well, can he feed it? And he gave it a bottle of cecropia leaves, and it revived it. It was just starving. And then this little boy, he became sloth mother. He slept with the sloth around his neck, fed it. And then when he left, I became sloth mother. And then after about a week, it was just big roly-poly belly, and it was just fine. And that sloth still is in residence at Asir. This is a research center up in a cecropia tree next to the lodge. And rainforests are very important, as we know, and this is what some of the kids have been doing. Here, these kids in D.C. put on a play of the Great Kapok Tree, and these kids in Fort Lauderdale put on a musical that knocked my socks off. And they wrote their own music and beautiful choreography. And in this way, the kids teach the whole community about the rainforest, and often they'll raise funds for rainforest preservation by putting on these plays.
It's a hell of a book. It never occurred to me it could be contorted into a musical.
Yeah, I must get hundreds of these videotapes and letters a year about schools or private companies that have put on this as a production. Yeah, and The Sea, the Storm, and the Mangrove Tangle is also now being used as a play.
Wonderful.
I have this friend, Mark Plotkin, and he was in the movie Amazon, the IMAX movie, and we wrote a book together called The Shaman's Apprentice. He wrote Tales of the Shaman's Apprentice.
Yeah, did he write Witch Doctor of the Hyannis, too? Or I read something by Plotkin when I was still evolutionary biologist, something ethnobotanical he wrote. I can't remember what, but yeah, he's really well known.
He's really famous for the Tales of the Shaman's Apprentice, which is a wonderful book about his work with the Tirio Indians in Suriname. So we went there, and this is the village Kwamala in on the Sipaliwini River, and this was the closest place to Eden, or heaven, I've ever been. And the people have very simple lives. They don't, by our standards, have anything. And so this really changed my outlook on life. And I came back and thought, I don't need all these things, you know, to be happy. And these people were the happiest people I've ever met. And I started just divesting of things and stopped buying things. And it's very liberating.
I was in Peace Corps for 3 years, and yeah, you wonder. You have one pot and one pan. It's like, why? Why do I need all this stuff in my kitchen? It does make you reconsider.
It really does. There's a group called New American Dream that's really great. It has ways of simplifying your life.
Cool.
So I got a lot of letters from kids. And when I wrote The Great Kapok Tree, I got a letter from someone out in the Pacific Northwest. And they said, you know, we have a rainforest right here in this country. And I didn't at that time know that. Of course, the old-growth forest. And so I went to visit the Willamette National Forest, and I had to write a book about it. It was just so staggeringly beautiful. And whoops, oh, I gave away the punchline. And so here's where I did my research. And it just, when these timber companies say, well, they're replanting, I mean, it's just so bogus, really, because this is an ecosystem that's evolved for thousands, millions of years. Things growing on things, growing on things. And whoops. And here's where I did my research in the Olympic National Park. And then I thought I'd go visit the Olympic National Forest. And this is what I saw. That's a picture from the Olympic National Forest, and I thought, how can that be a forest if there are no trees in it? And this was just really an eye-opener. And so I flew over with a Nighthawk and saw all these clear cuts. All the brown areas are clear cuts. And I found that although there's often a perimeter of old growth that's left by the roads, that once you get inside, many of these national forests are just completely clear cut. And then you've been reading about the landslides and how the flooding downstream, because the water isn't able to soak into the ground, it just runs off. And so I wrote this book called The Dragon and the Unicorn. And although it's a fantasy, all the facts in it are correct, where this dragon and unicorn live in the forest very happily, and until one day someone's coming and burning their trees and cutting them. And this is a king, and his daughter is a princess, and she's sympathetic toward the animals, so she brings these birds' nests deeper into the forest where they'll be safe. And then the king sends out his knights to capture the unicorn, and he almost does, but Valerio the dragon comes and burns the ropes and sets her free. Then they go into hiding behind the waterfall, and they wonder, how can they save themselves, and how can they save the forest? And they come up with a plan, and the unicorn appears to the princess and draws her deep into the forest, and there she gives her a short course on temperate rainforest ecology. And here she's teaching her how every year that a tree grows, it forms a ring, and they count 600 rings in this tree. And the unicorn's saying that when this tree was a little seedling, the forest was then a great forest. You know, they're thousands of years old. So kids are trying to save forests, you know, older forests near where they live. These are some kids in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and they had used this forest as a living classroom, and then it was bought by a developer, and he was going to clear cut it. And they said, what can we do? And the teacher said, well, let's go talk to the developer. Maybe we can ask him to save it, and we can call it the Eternal Forest of the Children. And so they went to the developer, and he said, well, I can't give it to you, but I can sell it to you for $100,000. And they said, we're just third graders. We don't have $100,000. But the teacher used it as a math problem, and they went into the forest, and they counted the number of trees, and they divided them into $100,000, and they came out with $14 a tree. And they said, well, let's just save it tree by tree. So the kids did walkathons and bake sales. And then they wrote letters to the editor. And these letters were about the science, you know, the ecology of an old growth forest, the importance of an older forest. And these letters were so compelling that the local radio station asked the kids to come on and speak about the forest. And they did, and then they got asked to be on TV. And once that happened, so many people saw them that they started sending in money. And these kids, in 6 weeks, raised not $100,000, but $200,000.
That's a great story.
Yeah. And they saved this forest. It's called the Estivant Pines, and they're safe They are now the eternal forest
Of the children. That's
Yeah,
perfect.
so that's pretty exciting. The kids are behind a lot of recycling programs, and they really can make a difference. A River Run Wild is used in a lot of fourth grade
Yeah.
classes. It's in the fourth grade, in many fourth grade textbooks, so it's part of the curriculum. And in this book, the Native Americans first come to the Nashua, then the colonists come, they drive the Indians from the land. The people from Europe come, they build mills, and they think of the river as a big garbage can. And at first, the river is able to wash away the waste, but then the pollution starts to accumulate, and in the 1950s, as unbelievable as it seems, the river looked like this. It was either, red, blue, green, whatever color they were dyeing the paper, and people don't believe me. So this is actually a photograph of the Nashua River. So in the book, one of the last remaining Indians has a dream, and in this dream, the first Indian who ever saw the Nashua when it was clean and beautiful comes back, sees the river all polluted and smelling, and he cries, and where his tears fall, the river is cleansed. And the Indian who has this dream wakes up and runs to his friend Marion Stoddard and says, we have to clean up this river. And Marion is responsible for creating the Nashua River Watershed Association, and she really is a remarkable woman. And so they organized, and they ended up cleaning up the river. And her, here kids were very involved. They would hold up signs like this, hold your nose, Nashua River ahead by the side of the road, and then the adults would see them and say, but isn't that impossible to clean up that river? And the kids would testify. They'd say, we just want this river the way it was when you were kids. You could fish in it, you could swim in it, you could drink it. And so they started, I think I'm going backwards, they started doing water testing, and realized when the science teachers would take the kids down to the river, there was nothing alive in it. When the river was red, that river was dead. And so the kids brought dirty river water to the politicians, and they got the river cleaned up. And over a 10-year period, the Nashua River Water Association worked to get this river cleaned up. They worked for a Clean Water Act, and Massachusetts passed the first Clean Water Act. And it's an amazing success story. They cleaned up this river. And now it's so clean that you can canoe on it, you can swim it, and it's it is a really world-class fishing stream. Yeah.
It's a great story.
So I got a lot of letters from kids about how they cleaned up their river, and this book has been, I thought it was a local book when I first wrote it, but then it was published in Japanese and all kinds of other languages. It's used all around the world, and it's an allegory, really, for what has happened to rivers during industrialization and how now people are cleaning them up.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty exciting story.
It's a great story.
Yeah.
I do have to ask you, though, the Native American crying, did you borrow that from the ad campaign?
No, I didn't.
That was the best anti-litter campaign I've ever seen.
Yeah, well, maybe subconsciously, because
the kids today wouldn't have seen it. I mean, I saw
No.
it when I was 5 or something.
but we never had a TV.
Ah, well
So
then
it wasn't until after I did that people started drawing my attention to it.
it's an image that sticks in people's minds, just like
Yeah.
your book. I mean, The River Ran Wild is a beautiful book. It's not local at all. We read it when we first came out here, and I'd actually seen it for sale in Australia, of all places.
kidding.
Yes.
It's because it is an allegory, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the same, different river, same story. Yeah, and so it's used widely around the country. One of the most exciting stories is this a true life story, how in Rockville, Maryland, these kids read the book and they thought, well, let's study the history of our river. And so they found that it had been a shad run. And they thought, well, can we make it a shad run again? So the teacher took them down. They did the water testing. They found that it was way too polluted to be a shad run. But like the kids in the book, they contacted the local authorities. Now there was a Department of Environmental Protection that they could contact. So they worked with that person, and they got the river cleaned up. And then they found that if they released shad in the river, the shad wouldn't be able to come back because there were dams. So these third graders got dams removed. They got 3 dams removed.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, it's amazing. Worked with their politicians. And then they raised these shad fry in their classroom, and they released them, and they released them like guess it was, what, in the summer, and then in the spring, and then the fish go out to the ocean, they change their morphology. They come all the way back.
Shad are fascinating,
They swim back up, and they came back, so the kids have restored this as a shad run. It's pretty amazing. And so this story was told by Sandy Burke, who taught the kids how to raise shad, in her book, Let the River Run Silver Again. Pretty remarkable story. But it's kind of exciting, you know, how the book creates this action that is then written about by another author.
Yeah.
It's really neat. So when I was a kid, I hated geography, but now I love it. And so I went all through Texas, and I have this little armadillo following my route through Texas, and this is the armadillo from Amarillo. He wonders, where in the world am I? And he goes up on the back of an eagle, and then it's sort of like Powers of 10, where he goes up and up from the surface of the earth and sees where in the world he is, and then he hooks up with the space shuttle. And I had to use the space shuttle because when I was a kid, one of my neighbors always wanted to be an astronaut, and she grew up and she became an astronaut. That's her in the middle. And she sent me some pretty amazing photographs from space when I was researching this book. And you can see from space how where there's clear cuts on rivers all around the whole globe, that you can see the silt coming down the rivers. And then this, what you're looking at here, is all the white things are clouds, and then the top is the land, and then in the middle, the mouth of the river, and then that's brown fingers of topsoil going out into the ocean. And she said, you see these fingers of topsoil. She's been up now 4 times in the shuttle, so 2 years apart, she'll see these fingers of topsoil getting longer and longer, where they go out into the ocean, and they cover coral reefs and seagrass beds. So this clear cutting has so many impacts, you know, the flooding, the trees themselves, the coral reefs, and it just amazes me that it's still going on. And here you can see the interface between the land and the ocean. So in the tropical areas, like in Florida, mangroves are really essential for taking some of that silt and sequestering it in the roots of the mangroves, and keeping the seagrass beds and the coral reefs from getting destroyed. And they're also really important as nurseries for fish and for protection of the coastal areas during hurricanes. And everyone knows about, you know, the story of Indonesia now, about the tsunami, and how it was the places where the mangroves were intact that protected the coastal areas, and the places where they had cut them were just, some of them, wiped off the face of the earth. So I wrote The Sea, the Storm, and the Mangrove Tangle actually well before the tsunami and before all these hurricanes. But it just happened to come out right when all these things were happening. And so I would really hope that this book would be part of the curriculum in Florida and coastal areas, because these mangroves are really pretty amazing. They, you know, the propagule, that's like a living seed, and they can actually float across the ocean, like from Africa to the Caribbean on currents, and plant themselves. And the book is also about biocomplexity, because in the beginning, the mangrove is just a really simple system, but then as it gets bigger and bigger, more and more things depend on it until you have a whole ecosystem built up. And that's a good, you know, really excellent rookery for birds, and also underneath for protection for and nursery for fish. And as this one fisherman says to the other, many of the fish in the sea start their lives in the tangled roots of the mangroves.
You know, looking at that illustration, are you ever tempted to do like a textbook or a science book? I mean, that illustration, if we can put that back up, that's a perfect depiction of biodiversity and ecosystems and food chains and so on. I mean,
well, you know,
it's gorgeous.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, my original background was biology, and we, you know, we usually get sketchy, turgid little things with arrows.
Well, the way they're teaching now, they use a lot of trade books as, not as textbooks, but, you know, to supplement the curriculum. And in fact, with No Child Left Behind, that's been kind of a problem, because it's harder for teachers to do that. And yet, you know, it was so important for teachers to be able to bring in these other materials. So I think that a lot of people are trying to change a lot of things about No Child Left Behind. So, you know, like taking kids outside. It's really hard to take kids outside with, you know, while you're teaching to the standards. So I think a lot of that is being rethought but really needs to be changed.
Yeah.
But this, the mangrove book is, I know, used in a lot of classrooms, and the Great Kapok Tree is in most every third grade textbook. And then there's a teacher's guide that Harcourt puts out that basically has those pictures and uses them for curriculum. And same with A River Ran Wild in their fourth grade Harcourt textbook.
So you're the fun part of the curriculum.
I am. I'm the fun part. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really important. I do the books that reach a kid's heart, you know, so that and the kids relate to the individual animals in the story, and then they're driven to ask more questions. So it's more inquiry based. You know, that the kids drive the curriculum. They ask, and then I had a teacher in Princeton who said, you know, we use the books, we take the kids outside, and then she said, I'm just there checking off all the standards I need to be teaching, and the kids are driving at the curriculum and asking the questions. So it doesn't mean just because you have to teach the standards doesn't mean that you stop taking kids outside or you stop using supplementary material. It's just you use it a little differently. Mangroves are not mangoes. A lot of people get them mixed up. So these are mangoes. This is a mango tree in Australia, just so you know.
Yeah, I had a mango in my backyard in the Philippines.
Okay. Good. And here you can see a little close-up of then a hurricane comes and the mangroves protect all the birds and
manatees.
Yeah.
Very close to our heart in the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Manatees and dolphins and mangroves. One of the biggest threats to mangroves is shrimp farms, especially in Indonesia. And so now I've also had to give up eating shrimp. And shrimp are awfully good.
Oh yeah.
But it really
can't you eat them if you know where they come from?
They almost
like
all
on Cape Cod or something. Don't they come from the ocean there?
Some restaurants will say that these are hand-caught shrimp or that they're sustainably caught shrimp, and yeah, sure, but most are not. So if it's not specifically on the package that they're sustainably harvested, that they usually come from these shrimp farms. And so if you want to help save mangroves, one of the things you can do is just stop eating shrimp and write to the shrimp companies, or write to these different, well, you can look on the website. There's all kinds of addresses that you can write to. Write to the government of Bimini.
We should mention this. You have a very informative website, too. Do you want to give them the URL so I don't mess it up?
Sure.
It's not too tricky.
It's just lynnecherry.com, L-Y-N-N-E, cherry, like the fruit, .com.
And if you dig into it, there's a lot of educational materials up there.
Yeah. If you click on the title of any of the books, like, for instance, you click on the title, you go to books and you click on the title of the mangrove book, it takes you into this whole website on mangroves and has a lot of pictures about Bimini because Bimini is in the process of destroying most of its mangroves. It was supposed to be a marine protected area.
Yeah.
And then a new group of politicians came in and then they sold it to a developer, and it's amazing. You look on this website, and I have links to this on my website, but you look on his website and he's actually advertising it as an eco-resort and saying about how he's got all this intact ecosystem when he has destroyed 99% of that ecosystem and is threatening the future of the lemon shark and a lot of other, and the people who have sustainably harvested the ocean for generations. So it's pretty sad. But you can write to the government of Bimini. I have all those.
And you can find on the very educational web. It is a great website. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Whoops. Oh, there it is. Okay. So this is in the Cayman Islands where they're teaching kids about the food web. And each child imagines that they're a different animal or critter or insect. And then if they have a relationship with some other animal or insect or ecosystem, then they give them a piece of this line. And then all the lines just going every which way like a big spider web, and it's a web of life. And I like this because it's a real visual example of a food web, and it's fun. You get the kids outside and do this food web exercise. And kids have been replanting mangroves in a lot of the tropical areas. You probably know how popular the Great Kapok Tree has been.
Yeah.
And one of the problems I have with that, I think it's really a good book about ecology. It's the basic ecological principles, like trees produce oxygen, and all living things are interconnected. I think that's really good thing about the book. But a lot of teachers have been using the great kapok tree and doing these big rainforests in the classroom instead of taking kids outside. And if it precludes taking kids outside, I'd much rather they didn't even teach about the rainforest, because I think the most important thing is that kids get outside and have firsthand experiences in nature.
Yeah.
And so on my website, I have a curriculum called Rainforest Your Forest, which is a way to teach about the rainforest comparatively, taking kids outside and looking at, well, how is this different? Well, all green things photosynthesize, looking at maybe collecting rain and looking at the difference in rainfall between the tropics and wherever you live. And all the other similarities and differences you can come up with hands-on.
Yeah.
And Flute's Journey was another attempt at getting this connection between where we live and the rainforest, because a lot of migratory birds fly between the rainforest and then all over North America, you know, where we live. So it's kind of a, well, flute is a wood thrush, and here at NCTC, there are so many wood thrushes. I wake up in the morning to the song of wood thrushes. It's so wonderful because they're really getting kind of rare. And then to come here where everywhere you go, it's this echoing, hauntingly beautiful song of the wood thrush, and you wake up to it. It's just beautiful. So anyway.
I have a theory on that.
What is your
It's
theory
totally
on
unscientific, but we have another great image here of a pelican sitting on a Pelican Island refuge sign. I think in some ways birds can sense areas in which they're appreciated or at least protected. I mean, it's nutty. I mean, my background is, like I said, biology initially, but I think you do attract more birds where there's at least kindness towards them or appreciation
they're
towards
safe.
them. Yeah, and they're safe too. But I mean, wood thrushes, people don't hunt them, but you know, they.
Yeah, cats do.
And there might be a more practical reason. We tried to keep the human imprint really small on the 540 acres. You know, we really compacted it, and so they may like that. Or you noted, probably most astutely, that we might have some of the right type of habitat for them where they like to nest.
You have correct habitat, and you also have a very big buffer zone around the woods from suburbia. So you don't have house cats coming in to kill them. I don't think. I mean, it will be a pretty long trek for a cat to go through.
No, we don't have too many feral cats out here.
And you probably have foxes and coyotes, which probably keep down the cats. And I haven't even seen a lot of cowbirds here. Cowbirds are one of the worst problems of these.
We have a good fox population around here, actually. The last couple of years, we've had fox dens right here on campus, which has been fun to see the little kits and so on.
That's wonderful.
But I digress. We were on Flute's Journey, and we went off. Oh, we have a couple questions. I don't know, Lynn, if you feel comfortable taking a question now from the audience, or wanted to run through the rest of this.
Oh.
What is your preference?
How much time?
15.
Oh, 15 minutes? Okay, I'm going to go really quickly for 5 minutes, okay?
In 5 minutes, we'll take the question.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go through this really quickly.
Okay.
Flute's Journey, the problems that he faces, pesticides, deforestation. And I won't tell this story, unfortunately, but this was an amazing story about how when I was writing this book, how I put flute in a woods called the Beltwoods, which was owned by the Episcopal Church. It had been in this man's family, Seton Belt's family, since it was given to them from the King of England, colonial days. They'd never cut a tree, and then it was given to the church with the understanding, well, it was in the will, that they would never cut a tree and never sell the land, but the Episcopal Church got the will overturned, and they wanted to sell it to a developer. And this is actually a long story. I'm trying to get a movie made of this because it was such an exciting story where kids got involved in this. They wrote letters to the bishop. Their letters got read on national television. We got on Sunday Morning News with Charles Osgood.
Oh, great.
They showed this picture of...
We even have the sound.
That's the song of the wood thrush, yeah. And so they played that on national TV.
Oh, that's great.
With that illustration. And so many thousands of letters came into the Episcopal Church that they decided to sell it to the Trust for Public Land, so Beltwoods is not going to look like this. And these are just some more schoolyard habitats. They're just some really remarkable schoolyard habitats. I encourage everyone who's watching this, if their children, if their community, their elementary and junior high schools do not have naturalized schoolyards, please try and make this happen, because instead of getting kids on a bus, yep, they can go out into their backyard and have their nature center right out the door. They can sit with binoculars in their library and watch the animals and really have close-up experiences. This is making a difference in the world. Here's where I live. And like NCTC, I have an intact ecosystem. No mosquitoes, because the barn swallows are sweeping the skies in the day. The chimney swifts are sweeping the skies at dusk, and the bats at night. And I have some very interesting nocturnal visitors. And I raise goats and have a beautiful garden and orchard. And sometimes my zucchini gets out of hand when I'm traveling.
Oh, so you are the groundhog. You are the source of that.
But How Groundhog's Garden Grew is a book to try and encourage kids to raise their own vegetables. And a lot of kids will see this and go, oh, that's how asparagus grow. Oh, that's how potatoes grow. But it's really how to compost and enrich your soil. I went on Martha Stewart to show her how to grow potatoes. And it talks a lot about biodiversity and beneficial insects. My next book I'm working on is about the ivory bill habitat, the cypress swamps in the south, the extent of the cypress swamps, how they used to be. And there's a group in Florida who saved their cypress swamp next to their school from development. They named themselves Save What's Left. They collected signatures. They got a bond issue on the ballot. And they were able to save 15 huge tracts of land in Coral Springs. Yeah, and that's another story I'm hoping to get made into either made-for-TV movie or a feature movie, because these cypress swamps are just really spectacular. I visited the Anasazi ruins, and I read Jared Diamond's book Collapse, and I thought, you know, we have a lot of these examples of local collapses, you know, people doing themselves in, and now with this issue of global climate change, we now have the potential of doing the whole globe in, all of us in, which is really a scary thought. So I've written this book on the scientists and how it is we know what we know about climate change. Camille Parmesan studying the checker spot. And in my mangrove book here, I have the picture of the hurricanes. You know, hurricanes we're seeing all these melting glaciers. And, you know, we know it's the CO2 going into the air. Kids are writing letters to their politicians. In Harrisburg, a group of kids were able to get their governor, Rendell, to pass a bill to make idling illegal, thereby stopping a lot of CO2 being put in the air. Another kid did this Care About Your Air poster. This child was showing how he was supporting solar energy. It's kind of, you know, putting a solar panel on his helmet. Yeah. But, you know, trying to encourage his politicians to give tax breaks for solar collectors. You can get a Prius. You can even fit your canoe on it.
That's important. Kayak easily.
Not your horse, but your canoe. Or, you know, with kids, instead of going somewhere far away in your car, you can just go someplace local and take a nice canoe ride, or go sit in a stream. Just simple pleasures of life. And going to work carpooling, or better yet, bike pooling, and growing a garden, and eating locally and organic. So these are just some suggestions. For Thanksgiving, with How Groundhog's Garden Grew at the end, they all have a big feast, and I was hoping to make Thanksgiving an Earth-related holiday again. This is something that you can do. So, you know, lots of suggestions, but what drives me to go around the country talking about these issues and showing kids that they can make a difference, empowering them, is that we have a great gift here. I mean, we've been given this world where all we breathe, everything we eat, everything we need comes from this planet. And it really is a great gift. And I think that every one of us needs to do as much as we can to give back and to make a difference in the world. And everyone can make a great difference in the world. So I would love to take questions.
All right, that's great. Why don't we take the questions? We're just going to patch them through in a sec. But that was a wonderful presentation. Thanks for sharing that with us. That was superb.
It was the fast version.
It didn't look that way. All right.
Hello.
Hello?
Hi.
Hi.
Lynn, there have been a lot of articles in the paper lately about songbirds and how the populations are down by 50 to 75%. Do you have anything to comment on that, or are you thinking about maybe writing a children's book about that?
Well, Flute's Journey is about that. That's exactly what it's about. It's about all the reasons that these birds are declining and the assaults on them. You know, pesticides is just a huge assault. You know, in fact, I just heard a story yesterday about someone here at NCTC had gotten a call that they had sprayed some kind of pesticide on their garden, and then their songbirds were lying there convulsing. So, you know, there you have cause and effect. And I think if for all of us listening out there, that we really need to make a more concerted effort to eliminate the use of lawn chemicals. I think lawn chemicals are killing these birds. Pesticides and lawn chemicals, spraying, agricultural spraying. That's just one thing, but I think that's probably the most pervasive, especially when we export a lot of the pesticides that are not allowed in this country.
Do you think that is also what is affecting the bees? Because those populations are down too.
Yeah, the bees, I've heard that too. I think it's multiple reasons. You have global climate change, so you see a lot of things changing. You see changes in range changes in a lot of animals, moving north, and you see, and just with being in a warmer temperature, you see with the forest, for example, how you have 2 generations of boring insects that are hatching out in the forest where you only had 1, and where the forest could cope with 1 but can't cope with 2. And perhaps it's the same thing with the bees, where, you know, they might have had tracheomites before, but with warmer weather or different parameters, you know, these things are changing. I know with a lot of the bees that the pesticides has been a problem, and that, you know, it's like with us, sometimes we can actually live having pesticide exposures, but we'll have neurological disorders, or we'll get cancer later, or our immune systems will be compromised. And I think I guess if I had to say one thing, it's as if the whole immune system of the whole planet is being compromised through all these multiple assaults. And so, although we can maybe survive, that our immune systems are not what they were, so they can't fight these assaults. And I think the same thing's happening with humans as it is with bees and with birds. It's just that we're not making at least immediate, well, you know, you can't really make those connections, because now with scientific proof you have to have cause and effect, and when it's multiple causes, it's very, very hard to tease out those causes. But I think it's kind of a no-brainer. It's kind of, you know, intuitively we know if we're spreading poisons all over the place, and prescription drugs are now in our water, and that all these pollutants are everywhere, it just simply can't be good for the whole system.
Reading Rachel Carson's words from 45 years ago. And,
yeah,
you know,
didn't we learn anything?
I know. The debate goes on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have another question, actually.
Hello?
Hi. Go ahead, Robin.
Oh, hi. Hi, Mark. Hi, Lynn. I loved your presentation. It's very inspiring and imaginative.
Thank you.
As you know, there's a Children of Nature movement sweeping the country. It is as if the skies have opened. How do you think the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service can contribute to the Children of Nature movement?
Well, I guess it all boils down to funding. You know, they have a certain amount of money, and they can spend it many different ways. And so if more of that money was directed toward getting kids outside, that would be very, very helpful. You know, or I know today Mark spent his morning taking kids out fishing. And so if the time of people who work for Fish and Wildlife was more freed up to take up, and that was a real priority, where the people who work for these agencies, that part of their time, part of their job description was maybe a day a week, you know, that they're taking a group of kids out and just letting them run free, you know, within constraints, but really explore and experience nature the way we did when we were kids. That would be a great thing to do.
How do you see your books doing that? How do you think the kids make the jump from reading the book to going out in nature?
I can only say through, well, the two books, A River Ran Wild and Flute's Journey, and the letters I've been getting, where with A River Ran Wild, the kids are then really curious about their own river, and so it seems to make them want to go down and look at their river and sort of look into the river and see what's there and learn about it. And then once they've been down to the river, then you've got them, you know, because it's like when we were kids. Once you've experienced the river, you fall in love with the river. Yeah. You know, you love being there, and just all the things you see happening whenever you go outside. You know, just these kind of amazing things. You know, some people sit on watch these things on TV, but if you go outside, you know, you'll see that hawk catch that cardinal, or you'll see that fish jump way out of the water, or you'll see, or the dragonfly will land on your hand. So, or you'll find that black sand is actually a seething mass of frogs that are only a quarter of an inch long. So, it's just getting them outside, and that nature sells itself.
Because Robin's question is well poised. She's one of the people helping us create this Children in Nature
program. Oh, that's wonderful.
And, you know, it's somewhat new. I mean, we've done some stuff on it, but probably not in a concerted way. And we have 96 million acres and refuges and so on. And I think we may need to tap into people like you who actually know children and have communicated effectively with them. What do we do? It's not just enough to open the gate and say, well, you know, you could go out here and walk on this boardwalk.
Right.
But to think about what their needs are. And I especially like hearing that you're getting feedback from kids, too. I mean, it doesn't occur to me reading the books, but people are writing you letters and so on. So you may be tapped more into their mindset. And
this sounds like something we could work on together, like the people who are listening and you and NCTC. I've also thought that we really need to partner with other groups like Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. That we should all be basically in this together. And they have I mean, the organizations are already there. It's just a matter of helping them to have these kids have this outdoor experience. So let's do it.
Let's do it. Well, this has been a very fast hour. I'm afraid we're just about out of time. So, Lynn, I'd like to thank you again so much for giving us this wonderful presentation and giving us some good ideas and hopefully beginning a longer-term partnership. I'd like to thank those of you who took the time to tune in this afternoon, and hopefully you'll tune in to our next series, Conservationists in Action. And thank you all very much.
Notice all these birds, and this place that I would go, I noticed that every year the same birds came back to the same nests and to the same nest holes, and this was their habitat. Yeah. So I illustrated this book called When I'm Sleepy. It was by Valerie Show Carey, I believe, and this is you can see the little girl imagining she's sleeping with these various creatures in their habitats.
It's so nice to see kids not afraid of raccoons or rabies. I mean, you know.
Yeah, there's a lot of fear-mongering.
Not to digress, but I mean, we've made kids so afraid of so much in nature. It's really problematic.
I do believe it's the media that has done that, and we're just, when you think of the danger of getting into a car, I mean, the risk is just so far more of a risk than going outside.
Yeah. Beautifully illustrated.
Yeah. Oh, that says Alsek Moben. This is When I'm Sleepy. It's by Jane Howard. I'm sorry, it was another book by that other author. So this is by Jane Howard. Habitat. Gotta have a habitat. It's a book by, a song by Bill Oliver. And there are 7 frogs in this picture, and they're camouflaged. And I explained to kids how a lot of reasons that the animals live in their habitat a specific habitat is because they can be really cryptic. They can almost disappear. And this is in my backyard.
Oh, wow.
And leaf litter. wet leaves are really important, as I'm sure a lot of the viewers realize that there's a real problem with frogs and amphibians die-off. And a lot of it is because people break up the leaves, they don't allow wet leaves to stay on the lawn, and it's destroying habitat. And I think we can all be very grateful to Richard Louv, who I know spoke here at NCTC, for his book, Last Child in the Woods, which put together a lot of the scholarly work on what he calls nature.
Hi, I'm Mark Madison, and I'd like to welcome you to another in our monthly series of Conservationists in Action. Today, we have a very exciting speaker. We're very lucky to lure here to Shepherdstown. We have children's author Lynn Cherry with us. And for those of you who haven't heard of Lynn, the very few of you who haven't, Lynn has written over 30 children's books, a number of which have won awards. She also illustrates them. A few of my favorites are The Great Kapok Tree, A River Ran Wild, The Armadillo from Amarillo, and my kids' favorite, How Groundhog's Garden Grew. I love your books. She's also been very active in trying to empower children and get them into nature. And she's been out here this week at NCTC talking with some of our students, talking with some of our staff out here, and just really adding a lot of value to our educational work out here. So Lynn, welcome to the studio, and it's so good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Lynn's going to talk a little about empowering children through books and nature, and I'm going to turn over to Lynn at this point. I would just like to remind those of you in the audience, this is actually a live broadcast, so if you have any questions for Lynn about her children's books, about children and nature, about empowering children and things you can do for the environment, please feel free to call in, email in, fax in, any means you can communicate with us. We'd love to hear your questions. All right, Lynn, let me turn over to you.
Well, I just thought I'd begin before I show the PowerPoint
Okay.
to show the audience this Japanese stiltgrass, which I picked on the way here. And this became, it's an invasive species, and I noticed it at my place. I have a farm about 3 years ago, and I didn't realize it was such an invasive, and now it's completely carpeting my whole forest floor and has pushed out all the native wildflowers. So this is just along the edges here at NCTC, and you have time to teach your deficit disorder about how kids are growing up without the advantage of connecting to nature and to the natural world.
He did one of these broadcasts, and this is a nice follow-up, because
Oh,
one of the
that's
things
great.
Richard said is we need new ways to entice children to nature, and I think your books do a wonderful job of that.
I think they do. I'm really happy that it seems to be working. Because whenever kids go outside, it's an adventure.
Yeah.
Just stepping outside the door, something happens. You know, whether it's finding a turtle or just watching the birds or listening to the bird song. So one of the things that I've been promoting is schoolyard gardens, backyard gardens and schoolyard gardens. And of course, National Wildlife Federation has had this program for many years. But this is a school I visited in Virginia, Tuckahoe Elementary, where the whole curriculum revolves around outdoor education and their schoolyard garden. And they teach about how habitat is really important for, to provide wildlife with food, shelter, and place to live, place to raise their young. The first thing that you can do, whether it's your backyard, your schoolyard, your nature center, really simple thing is just plant sunflowers, because goldfinches, tufted titmice, a lot of birds just love those sunflowers. And I actually prefer them to a bird feeder, because the birds are still acting like birds and they're learning how to forage, and plus they're beautiful. And also they're also beneficial for pollinators, bees and butterflies. And then you can plant other kinds of flowers that will attract hummingbirds. So there's a book by Steve Kress called The Backyard Bird Garden. It's a wonderful book, and it explains how you can plant certain plants that will attract certain birds. You can actually garden for specific birds to attract them.
Steve did one of these programs too,
Did he
many years
really?
ago in 1999.
Oh, these are
The other thing you can just
whoops, I'm going to get the hang of this. So this is part of the book, Kitty's Adventures. I didn't include this in Archie Follow Me, but when I was about 8, my cat disappeared, and she was like a dog. She'd follow me everywhere. And when I finally found her, she was in a steel leg hold trap. And you can see her paw was stuck in the trap, and she'd been in this trap for 4 days. She'd lost a lot of blood, and she was very weak. We had to find someone who could get this trap open. And the vet wanted to put her to sleep, but I said, no, I wanted to to nurse her back to health, and I did, and she lived to be a ripe old age.
No, that's a great story.
Yeah.
Except for the leg trap.
Yes.
Sorry for the kitty.
But that's how I learned about steel leg hold traps, and I knew that as an adult I would never wear a fur coat after seeing the torture that my cat went through, realizing that foxes and all kinds of animals captured for fur coats go through the same. So the place that I spent my childhood, it was in a suburb, but it was on the edge of farms and fields and creeks, and so I used to play in a place very much like this. And I think that most people who go into environmental education, who work at nature centers, that they'll tell you the same story, that they bonded with nature at an early age.
Yeah.
And so this is so important that kids get out in nature, and this is really what I'm committed to, is connecting kids to the natural world. So I was, well, I'll go back to this Archie Follow Me book for a minute. So I would sit still as a statue, and all these animals would come out of hiding, and they'd come right up to me. Like in this case, a pheasant came right up to she came right up to my foot and then sniffed it, and I realized that, and then she realized that I was human, and she went squawking off into the underbrush with her chicks. And, oops. So, as I sat there like a statue, I do something.
We'll learn from your experience.
Learn from my travails, and just if it comes in a lot on mowers, like if you have someone mowing your lawn, the lawn companies, and it's
Have you been able to control yours at all, or is it too late now?
It is too late, so that's why I thought I'd share this with you before it's not too late, and people out there, Japanese stilt grass.
Okay. Well, thanks for empowering NCTC. And now, do you want to go into some of the slides?
Sure. Yeah. Let's just go into the slides. This is a presentation that I give all around the country, actually all around the continent, and I start by talking about how it is that I started writing and drawing. And my mom was an illustrator. She was an illustrator of children's magazines when I was a little kid. And I have a book called Making a Difference in the World that shows me and my little card table doing illustrations while my mom was doing illustrations. And then I grew up and became an illustrator. And then she followed in my footsteps, and she became a children's book illustrator. And this is one of her books, The Floating House. It's a history by Scott Russell Sanders. And she's really done some beautiful books, The Real Tooth Fairy, whoops, and this is probably her most popular. So anyway, when I was a kid, I had inspiration, and I would do these little books like this, Kitty's Adventures. And this was a book about my cat, and I learned a lot from my cat. I learned that if you sit absolutely still in the woods, that the animals come up to you. And so I would go and do this. That book I brought to my publisher when I was in my 20s, and she said, "This is a really good story you wrote when you were 8, but you've improved a little bit as an illustrator. So can you redo the illustrations?" And I did, and so they published it as this book here, Archie Follow Me. And then